Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at a horror story.
Ooh, fun.
Yeah, and this one is particularly interesting because it really explores the dark side of insomnia,
Okay.
identity, and even maybe fate.
Interesting.
So the story follows this guy named Evan, and he's plagued by sleeplessness, and he encounters a figure that looks exactly like him.
Wow.
And it gets pretty creepy from there. Have you ever had that feeling of like being watched?
Oh, yeah.
Like somebody's shadowing your every move?
Totally.
Well, this story takes that feeling and really turns it up to 11. So,
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really interesting is how the story uses the setting right away
right.
to create the sense of unease.
Oh, for sure.
Like the empty city streets, the looming presence of this warehouse.
Yeah.
Like it all feels desolate and just charged with this kind of silent menace.
It's like the city itself is a character.
Yeah.
It's like holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. You can practically feel the cold air and hear Evan's echoing footsteps as he walks those deserted streets.
Totally. And then on top of that, you've got the doppelganger,
Yeah,
which adds a whole other layer of psychological terror.
totally. So can we talk about the doppelganger for a second?
Sure.
Like, what is it about that figure that's so inherently creepy?
Well, I mean, the doppelganger in literature, it often represents like our shadow self, like the part of us that we try to hide or deny.
Right.
And in this case, Evan's double really seems to embody all of his anxieties and his fears.
So it's like he's literally facing his darkest self.
Exactly, it's externalized and made flesh.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. And the way that the story ramps up the tension is masterful.
Oh, for sure.
Like each encounter with the doppelganger is more unsettling than the last.
Yeah.
And it leads to that moment where Evan hides from the approaching truck.
Oh, yeah.
Like, what did you make of that scene?
Oh, that scene for me was like brilliant foreshadowing of the danger to come. Like it's this glimpse into how inescapable Evan's situation really is, like a hint that something truly horrific is on the horizon.
Totally. And then, of course, you have that shocking discovery in the basement.
Oh my God, the basement.
Yeah, talk about a moment that just sends chills down your spine.
Right. It's not even just what he finds down there,
Right.
but the implications of it all.
Yeah, like, what do you think the author is trying to say with that?
Well, to me, the basement scene is where the story takes this really sharp turn into the truly macabre.
Right.
I mean, it's filled with bodies that all look like Evan.
Right.
And it suggests that he's trapped in some kind of horrifying cycle, like a repeating nightmare that he just can't escape.
And that's where things start to get really, really interesting, right? Like, are we dealing with a time loop here? Is he destined to relive this horror over and over again?
That basement scene, I mean, it really throws a wrench into our understanding of the story.
Yeah, it's like stepping into a twisted funhouse mirror, where reality itself seems distorted and unreliable. And that feeling of unease, that feeling of not being able to trust your own senses, it just intensifies as the story progresses.
It really does. And it makes you wonder, is Evan actually making choices?
Right.
Or is he just a puppet being manipulated by some unseen force?
That's a great point, especially when we consider the possibility of a time loop, right?
Right.
If Evan is reliving these same events over and over again,
Yeah,
does he even have the ability to change his fate?
that's a good question.
Or is he just doomed to repeat this cycle of horror for all eternity?
Yeah, it's a bleak concept.
It's pretty bleak, but it's also incredibly compelling.
It is. And, the story doesn't shy away from that bleakness. It really embraces it, creating this suffocating atmosphere of inevitability.
Like Evan's growing sense of dread,
Yeah.
his realization that something terrible is about to happen. It mirrors our own growing sense of unease as readers.
Totally. It's like we're right there with him, trapped in this nightmare,
Yeah.
powerless to stop what's coming. And that ending, oh man, that ending,
I know.
where he just accepts his fate,
Right.
knowing that he's going to be pulled back into this cycle of violence.
It's chilling.
It's terrifying. I think that ending is just a masterclass in psychological horror. There's
Okay.
no grand showdown, no heroic last stand.
Right.
Just quiet, resigned acceptance of this horrifying reality.
And it leaves you with this lingering sense of unease.
Totally.
Like this feeling that maybe we're all trapped in our own personal cycles of fear and despair.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
It's definitely not a story you forget easily.
No.
Like it gets under your skin and it stays with you. It makes you question your own sense of control your own place in the grand scheme of things.
Absolutely. And that's what good horror is all about, right?
Yeah, it's not about the jump scares or the gore.
Right.
It's about tapping into those primal fears,
Yeah,
the anxieties that lurk in the back of our minds and forcing us to confront them head on.
exactly.
So speaking of confronting fears, I have to ask, what did you make of the cyclical nature of the narrative? Do you think the time loop itself is like a metaphor for something deeper?
That's a fascinating question. I think it could be interpreted in a few different ways.
Okay.
On one level, it represents the repetitive nature of trauma.
Okay.
You know, the way that certain events can just keep replaying in our minds.
Right.
Haunting us long after they've occurred.
So it's like a psychological prison.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Evan's constantly reliving his worst nightmare.
But on another level, the time loop could also be seen as a commentary on the human tendency to repeat our mistakes,
Right.
to fall back into destructive patterns of behavior.
Yes. It's like we're all caught in our own personal loops.
Right.
Making the same choices.
Yeah.
Experiencing the same consequences over and over again.
It's a pretty bleak outlook,
It is.
but I can see how it fits with the overall tone of the story,
Right.
this sense of inescapable doom, this feeling that we're all just cogs in a machine far larger than ourselves.
It all comes back to the question of free will, right?
Right.
If we are indeed trapped in these cycles, these predetermined patterns,
Yeah.
can we ever truly break free?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is a big one.
It's a heavy question, and one that the story doesn't provide any easy answers to.
No, it doesn't. But I think that's part of what makes it so thought-provoking.
Right.
You know? It challenges us to examine our own lives, our own choices, and to ask ourselves, are we truly in control of our own destinies?
It's definitely a story that makes you think,
For sure.
and maybe even lose a little sleep. But that's what good horror is all about, right?
Absolutely. And in this case, the horror lingers long after you finish reading.
Yeah.
It makes you contemplate the nature of reality, the power of fear,
Right.
and the unsettling possibility that we might not be as free as we think we are.
So much to unpack there. Okay, so we've talked about the unsettling atmosphere, the heart-stopping basement reveal, and of course the whole concept of the doppelganger.
Right.
But you know what I keep coming back to?
What's that?
This idea of the time loop.
Yeah.
Do you think the author intended it as like a literal time loop? Or is it more of a metaphorical representation of something else?
That's a really good question. I mean, it really gets to the heart of the story's ambiguity.
Right.
Like, on the one hand, you have the narrative presenting these repeating events, this sense of inevitability
Yeah.
that suggests an actual, like, literal time loop.
Right.
But on the other hand, the story never explicitly confirms it.
That's true.
So it leaves room for other interpretations.
So it's like the author's inviting us to question the nature of reality itself,
Yeah.
to consider that, things might not be as straightforward as they seem.
Exactly. And I think that ambiguity is part of what makes the story so effective.
Oh, totally.
It forces us to engage with the text on a deeper level, right? To fill in the gaps with our own interpretations and anxieties.
So even if we can't definitively say whether or not it's a literal time loop, the very possibility of it
Yeah.
adds this whole other layer of psychological terror.
For sure. Like, it creates this sense of claustrophobia, this feeling of being trapped
Right.
in a situation where there's no escape.
And that feeling is just amplified by the cyclical nature of the violence.
Oh, yeah.
The way that Evan seems destined to both inflict and experience the same horrifying fate over and over again.
It's a disturbing concept, for sure.
It is.
But it does raise some interesting questions.
Right. Like what?
About the nature of identity and agency.
Okay.
I mean, if we're constantly reliving the same events, making the same choices, are we really in control of our own lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. It's a question that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries.
Right.
And the story just takes that age-old debate and frames it within the context of this chilling horror narrative.
And it does so with this masterful blend of psychological insight
Yes.
and atmospheric dread. I mean, this story isn't just about scares. It's about exploring the darkest corners of the human psyche.
Totally.
Those places where fear and despair take root.
It's about the fragility of our sense of self, the unsettling realization that we might be more vulnerable than we care to admit,
Right.
more susceptible to forces beyond our control.
And that is a truly terrifying thought.
It is.
This story doesn't offer any easy answers,
No, it doesn't.
but it certainly leaves a lasting impression.
It does. It's a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling horror
Yeah.
is the kind that stays with you long after you've finished reading. The kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about reality and the nature of your own existence.
Wow. Well, this deep dive has certainly given us a lot to think about.
It has.
It's a story that will stay with me for a long time, and I suspect it will do the same for our listeners.
I think so too.
So if you're looking for a horror story that'll challenge you intellectually and emotionally,
Yeah,
this is definitely one to check out.
for sure.
Just be prepared to lose a little sleep.
Maybe keep the lights on.
Yeah, good advice. Thanks for joining us on this chilling exploration of fear, identity, and the unsettling power of the unknown.